Thanks so much for joining us. We are so excited to have our guest with us today, Dr. Ezra Karger. We'll have a little bit more introduction here in just a second. I'm Colette Bartow, the Continuing Ed Coordinator at the Montana State Library, and Tracy Cook is here, our lead consulting and learning librarian. She's going to say a few more words as we get started. But we always shared this disclaimer. This is a discussion and a learning opportunity that brings us in connection with a lot of great research and information that can help us inform what we do here in our local communities. Our topic is connecting with local government officials. This is the fourth in our series on that topic. And Ezra is going to be honing in on better libraries, better achievement, and then better futures for our communities with his visit today. Let's see here. I think I've got one more thing. I added this short bio. And Tracy, if you wanted to take it away from here, that would be marvelous.
Yeah. So welcome, everyone. I think some of you have been able to attend the webinar series as we've had this throughout the last year. We started this series because as we were talking to local government officials, we were looking for better ways to explain the value that libraries bring to their community members. And many of you may remember I kicked off this series with Dr. Greg Gilpin, who's a colleague of Ezra's. And he talked about the value of libraries from the perspective of an economist. Ezra's passion is looking at the impact of government policy on children and families. And I will just share, as Colette and I were meeting with him, I really enjoyed his enthusiasm and his laid back nature. So I do want to encourage you. Colette and I will be monitoring chat, but as Ezra goes through and shares his research with you, please don't hesitate to ask questions. Because he really does want this to be a value to you, and he's very approachable. So he is definitely willing to explain what you are seeing. So with that, Ezra, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Let me just share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay. So maybe I'll start off by telling you a little bit about this project and why I started working on it. So this is work joint with Greg Gilpin at Montana State University and Peter Nenka at Miami University of Ohio. And I'm a researcher in a little bit of a strange place. I'm at the Federal Reserve, which is normally a central bank, but we have large research teams that study the economy, study how interest rates and inflation work, but also longer run questions about the labor force and how children enter the labor force and how wages are determined and like what happens with people's educational investment and human capital investment. So across the Federal Reserve System, there are maybe 1,000 research economists who are studying a variety of topics that end up being important in various places. During COVID-19, health economists who normally study health had a lot to say about the macroeconomy. And similarly, at various points in time, questions about education and infrastructure and investment in schools and related resources become very important in the US. And so we're here in case that happens. This work that I'm going to present today is really about how libraries affect children. But it stemmed out of a broader research agenda looking at the institutions in local communities and how they affected not only children, but also the communities as a whole. So my dissertation was funded by the Department of Education, and it focused on these types of questions. And I have a different paper that I won't talk about today that actually uses data from the early 1900s to say, when Andrew Carnegie first funded 1,600 public libraries across the United States, what happened to the people in those communities? What long-run effects did it have on people in those communities? And so this is going to be the modern day version of that using different data that's in some ways better, in some ways worse. And I'll get to talk a little bit about that today. And this paper, I left the old date on it, but we finished it in 2021. The publication process takes a while, so it was published more recently. But some of the results I present today, as you'll see, are going to be talking about data that ends in 2019, 2020, or 2021, because that's when we had the data we used for these analyses. So I don't think I need to convince people on this call about this, but public libraries are important. and they're also understudied. And that is something I know more about as a researcher. So in the US in 2018, there were over 9,000 public library systems and over 15,000 separate library branches. And libraries spent $12 billion on their services, and over 85% were funded by city and county governments. So unlike a lot of institutions, libraries are really paid for by the people who use them, by the people in the communities who live near the libraries, go to the libraries, and they're used a lot. I forget what the exact statistic is. I think it's something like more than half of Americans go to a library every year. And patrons checked out over 2 billion items in 2018, with children checking out more than 750 million items and attending millions of events, right? We don't know how many unique children have attended events, but the libraries report to one of the data sets that I'll talk about how many times they click, yes, on a child attended an event. And there were 80 million independent attendances of events by children in 2018. So libraries are widely used. They're funded by local communities. And there's a lot of questions. There are a lot of questions floating around in national and local debates about what should happen with funding for libraries. So here's an example article. US libraries hope for billions in federal aid for infrastructure. Funding would be the largest congressional amount since 1997, and advocates say it can't come soon enough. There are many people saying that libraries are underfunded. There was a push in 2020, 2021 to potentially increase investment in public libraries using some of the funding that was part of the big investment bills that were being discussed at the time. And what this means is, libraries are always arguing that they should get more funding from the federal government, which does very little to fund them. They're also talking locally about what should happen with different priorities that cities and towns have. So I was Googling around because I don't know that much about Montana. I've been there once in my life, and it was beautiful. But Montana has similar questions about funding. So Great Falls commissioners passed cuts to libraries to support public safety. This measure is a compromise after months of negotiation and debate that pit the library against public safety departments that have long been neglected. So Great Falls had this concern, which is there was a referenda passed to fund libraries more, and there was a referenda that failed to fund public safety more. But there wasn't a lot of money to fund both of these things, and there had been no increases in public safety funding for 20 years. And so they had to make decisions at the local government level about how to trade off money that was set aside for libraries and other local priorities. And this is not an uncommon debate. If I Googled in every state, in every recent, local election, local discussion, bond referenda surrounding public library support, discussions within local communities about public library support, those are everywhere. And it's because public libraries get most of their funding from local government. Okay, so the research question that I'm going to ask and try to answer today is, when a local community invests in a public library system, how does it affect children's academic performance? And this is going to be in many ways a narrow question. We know that libraries have lots of positive effects on various groups of people, but some of those positive effects are pretty hard to quantify. And so in this paper, we're going to say, let's use tools that we use in statistics and economics and econometrics to really dig into this very specific question of what happens when a community invests in their public library system to the children living nearby, to their test scores, to their academic performance. This is going to be, there are lots of concerns about using test scores as a key academic outcome. We don't argue in this paper that tests are all that matter. But what's nice about test scores is they're commonly collected across the United States. You can link information about public libraries to them, and you can then look at these effects in a causal framework. And so that's what we're going to do today. And we think this has important implications for negotiations about local spending and taxes, and for understanding the benefit of libraries beyond the availability of books. So we know, making books available to people is great. People like reading, people like listening to audiobooks or ebooks or going to events. But how do we measure the effect that has beyond people's preference for it, beyond the fact that people like books? Can we say, yes, this has important effects on outcomes that policymakers tend to care a lot about? That was the question we wanted to dig into today. So what do? We use this incredible data given to us by public libraries through the IMLS's Public Library Survey, which we'll talk about more, to identify all the cases where a public library system invests in large capital expenses. These can include new buildings, large-scale renovations, additions, general improvements, HVAC improvements. Anytime a library system says, yes, we pay normally for staff and book acquisitions, But this year, we're going to do something big. This year, we're going to, spend a few $100,000, or in some cases, millions of dollars, totally improving our library system. We are going to link these instances of dramatic improvements in local libraries to children's academic performance in the years following those capital expenses. And we're going to compare places which did those improvements to places that had not yet done those improvements but would later, or to control places that never had improvements like that. And we're going to see how the children in the places with the improvements perform differently on test scores relative to the children in these places that are the control units. So that's going to be the plan for today. Now, I have not changed this talk much from what I would say to a bunch of economists. And so there might be words here or methods here that are not familiar to you. I'm going to try to explain it all very clearly to an audience that doesn't just think about math all day in the way that I can get too excited about. But if anything is confusing, please do let me know. So let's talk about the data. We have incredible data on library spending and services from the Public Library Survey. So this is a census of public libraries conducted by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, IMLS, every year. It contains rich annual data for the universe, like almost 95% or more of libraries. And thank you all for filling out these forms, if you are the ones who are filling them out. And what it tells us as researchers is it tells us how much money libraries are spending on staff, book acquisitions, and other operating expenses. And then how much the library is spending on capital expenses. So when a library system invests in a capital spending project, we learn this from this survey. It tells us how many employees work at the library, it tells us how much they're paid in aggregate. It tells us the stock and amount of new purchases by type, so things like books versus audiovisual collections. We learn about circulation. So what was the total circulation, both general and specific to children's related items? We also learn about programming. What was the number of and attendance at events? And these are separated out into general attendance and then also attendance by children at children's events. And what's lovely about the data is it's available for many years, going back to at least 1992. And so we can see these capital expenditures going back decades, which lets us talk about some of these longer run multi-year effects of public libraries that are often hard to measure. So, student test data. The test score data is harmonized district level student testing data from Stanford's Opportunity Project. It's called the CETA files. And what they do is they go to every state and they say, you produce data on the test scores of your children because No Child Left Behind, which was a law passed 2 decades ago, required that states collect this information about their students. And these folks at Stanford put this all onto the same scale so that we can compare students in different places and over time. It exists for almost all school districts in the United States, and it's derived almost entirely from math and English language test scores in most districts. So we're not going to think here about science or other topics that are also important. Now, it's available for fewer years because of when this data was collected, but for grades 3 through 8, we have data between 2009 and 2018. So this is a map showing the average test score performance in the United States from CETA. And I want to start by saying, don't focus too much on different regions and which regions are performing better or worse. It's obviously very hard to compare regions. There are different types of students in these areas. Test scores are only one measure of academic performance. But what you can see is that within every state, there are some areas with higher test scores. There are some areas with lower test scores. Across states, some states have higher average test score performance than others. This varies a lot. And it varies a lot by urban or rural areas. It varies a lot by places that are rich or poor. But none of these explain all of the variation in test scores. My main goal of this map is to show you that our data cover a wide swath of the United States. And we can see people in Montana. We can see people in California. We can see people in Florida, right? We're not restricted to any one region. And so when we think about the Public Library Survey, we can really dig in and use variation in capital spending across the entire United States. We can look at places in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Florida that have these expenses. They invested a lot in their public libraries. We can also look at places in California that did. And in all of these states, we also have places that did not, that chose not to invest in their public libraries with these large capital expenses. And that's going to let us do these types of comparisons that I'm talking about today. So what do we do in our library level analysis? I'm now going to present a series of plots that are very hard to understand. And so I want to talk through them very carefully. And they're all going to look a bit like this. So in economics, we often use these tools called regressions. And a regression is just a comparison, like I've been talking about. It's a comparison of places where something happens and something doesn't happen. And so what this plot is, and I'm just going to say it to start, and then we'll dig into the words that I'm using. It is log capital spending in the 10 years before and after libraries decided to invest in their public library systems. And so what we see here is that in the 10 years before a large-scale public capital spending on a public library system, there's very little change, right? There's this flat line on the from -10 to -3, where the libraries that are going to end up investing a lot in public, investment in their capital expenditures on their public library system, they're not really doing much when it comes to capital spending relative to the control units. And then at year 0, which is the middle of the graph here, which is when we've identified these large public library investments, we see this huge spike in capital spending. And I'm going to put these in context because the numbers on the y-axis are kind of hard to understand. So you can see that this spikes up to maybe 7.5. Let's think of that as roughly a 750% increase in public library investment relative to baseline. That's not exactly what it is, but it's approximately that. And what this means is that, let's say, in most years, there's small capital spending decisions made. Like you have to fix the HVAC unit, you have to fix the flooring in your library. You're spending maybe $20,000 a year on capital expenses. Suddenly, we're going to increase by almost a factor of 10 to like $200,000 in this 1 year, the amount of capital spending that the libraries do. And the other thing that I love about this graph is that what you can see is that after this huge spike in capital spending, you then see this huge decline. So once a public library system decides to put in this huge amount of money into capital spending, they then dramatically reduce the amount of capital spending they do for 10 years following that expenditure. And why does that happen? Well, usually what happens is there's a building, it's falling apart a little bit, as all good buildings are, and you need to invest regularly in its upkeep. But let's say you suddenly build a new building. That building is now beautiful, everything's new, the plumbing's new, the wires are new, the lighting's new, the bookshelves are new. What that means is it generally needs less upkeep in the years following that big capital expenditure relative to the years before. And so we're seeing this play out in this graph very clearly. Okay, so what this graph is supposed to show you is that we have successfully identified a bunch of libraries where there was a sharp increase in capital spending, okay? So what are we going to do with this? Well, let's look at what else happens to the libraries around this moment when there's big investment in the public library system. This is the number of visits to the public library system. And this is probably my favorite graph in our paper, because what you'll see is that we have 10 years of data before and 10 years after. And in the 9 years leading up to this big capital spending, there's no change. You can think of that 0 as meaning no change in visits to the library. And then in the year when there's the big capital spending, visits drop by 0.05, which is 5%. So why are visits dropping? Well, I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we had a main public library building, which was renovated. And when it was renovated, they immediately temporarily moved the small number of books that they felt they could move to an old school, which was a much worse building temporarily for the library. And so I went less often. And that's what this plot is picking up. It's picking up the fact that while you're renovating the library or while you're, improving it in a clear, large way, people don't go as often. But what happens immediately after you open the new, better public library a year later? You see that immediately visits spike. So the year after the big capital spending, visits are up 10%. By 2 or 3 years later, they're up 20%. And by 4 or 5 years later, you're getting to a point, well, by 8 to 9 years later, you're getting to a point where visits are 30% higher than they were before the capital spending. So what does this mean? One of the things you do when you invest in your public library system is you convince people to come to the library more. And it gets people more excited to come to the library. They now show up at a 30% higher rate. You used to have 10,000 visits a year. Now you have 13,000 visits a year. And that's a huge increase. And it shows that there is real demand for libraries that have experienced these large capital improvements. So I think this is directly policy relevant. What happens to the circulation of children's items? this plot looks very similar, right? We have a flat line before the shock, before suddenly there's this sharp change in the public library system. And then a year after this happens, circulation of children's items goes up 10%. 2 years after, it's up 20%. And by 8 to 10 years after, it's 30% higher than it was in the years before the shock, before the choice to invest in the public library. And I want to maybe stop here to talk about how much investment is happening. You can think of the investment as being roughly on the order of $200 per child living in the area. So we're not requiring that it be like $1 million of capital spending. If you're in a small town with 1,000 kids, then let me just make sure I don't get the numbers wrong. It would be 10,000, 100,000. It's a $200,000 expenditure, right? And so that's a big amount of money. But if we're talking about New York City, we're talking millions and millions of dollars to improve the library system to the same level. So this is scaling that. And it's saying whenever there's this big choice to invest in your public library relative to how big your library is, we see these increases, these 30% increases in use of the library, which is tremendously valuable, I think. Okay, what happens to attendance at children's events? So similar to the number of visits, the year when the renovation is happening, children's events plummet, right? And children don't go to events. And why is that the case? Well, I have 2 kids under the age of 4. If you tell me that we can't go to our favorite like room in the building with the nice rugs and we instead have to go to the temporary schoolhouse or like something closed, I'm not going to bring the kids, right? But the year after, they're back to normal. 2 years after, they're 15% higher. And 8 to 9 years after, we're at a 30% increase in the number of children who are attending events within the library, okay? So what we're seeing is very consistent across these measures, which are all reported in the PLS. We've done our complicated statistics to get to the bottom of what happens. And after a public library invests in their local, buildings, we see this 30% increase in use of the library. So that's one big takeaway from this work. So what happens to test scores, right? I promised you some information about children's achievement. Here, I'm going to present 4 graphs, and they're going to be the same format as before, but we're only going to look 7 years before and 7 years after because we don't have as many years of test score data. The top left is reading test scores. And so what you can see with reading test scores here is that they go up. They start off pretty flat, and then they start to increase 3 to 4 years after this big investment in the public library system, and they remain higher 5 to 6 years after than they were beforehand. Now, what are the units here? This is what's called a standard deviation unit, and it's a unit that's often used to describe test scores, but it's very hard to understand what it means. So these are not incredibly large effects, right? These are not like we're suddenly taking everyone from not reading to reading by investing in the public library system. But these are noticeable large effects that I think are very important to consider. So a 0.02 or 0.03 standard deviation increase, that is similar in size to many other types of interventions that improve schools. And so what we're finding in this paper is that you can make libraries better, and that will help children in the same way that sometimes making schools better can help children. And we think there's a lot of value to that. Okay. The bottom left panel is math test scores. And what I like about this plot is you see less of an effect for math test scores, right? So it seems like public libraries are affecting the outcome we would think would be most effective, which is reading test scores. But there still might be a small, very small positive effect on math test scores, but it's noisy. And then there's a big question that people have when they look at this paper, especially if they're economists or statisticians. They can say, well, what about other stuff that might be going on when a public library system decides to invest in the library? Maybe they also, in that local town, decide to invest in the schools, and the schools get better. And maybe that's what's driving these results. Maybe that's why we see these improvements in test scores. And so in the top right panel, what we do is we say, let's look at smaller capital expenditures. Let's look at examples where public libraries are investing in capital spending, but they're doing it at a smaller level. And what we see in the top right is that that leads to no change in test scores, right? There's no change in reading test scores when that happens. The bottom right is what we call a placebo check. What we say is, well, we're looking at kids who are living right near a library that just invested in capital spending, right? What about libraries that are 20 miles away? So a library 20 miles away won't be attended as often, or 50 miles away won't be attended as often by children in the area. So if 30 miles away, some library has $1 million in spending, does that change the test scores of the people who are in the initial town. And what we show here is that it has no effect. There's no change in the reading test scores for kids living farther away from the library. So this is driven by very local effects on the community of interest where the public library is based. Those are the children who are really benefiting from these public library investments. Okay, so that is the test score data. So I want to talk a little bit about conclusions and implications for policy and practice. So our results really show that funding public libraries can improve children's academic outcomes. And I want to maybe highlight not only the test score effects, but also what I showed you with the first set of graphs, which is that it's not only the test scores that go up, use of the library system also goes up. You see 30% increases in attendance of events by children, in visits to the library, in circulation of children's materials. And so children are using the library more, and they are also benefiting when it comes to test scores. Now, let's talk about community engagement, right? This relates to the topic of the talk. Highlighting these gains might help secure broader community support and budget appropriations for libraries. So one thing that always struck me as someone who uses libraries a lot is that folks in the library space, when they advocate for public library funding, it's often based on anecdotal evidence, and it's very hard to base it on data, besides for like lots of people are using the library. So if you say lots of people are using the library, so we should spend more money on libraries, people can say, well, lots of people use public parks, so let's spend more money on public parks. It's very hard to differentiate what a public library is doing from what other local institutions are doing. And our results, which are in a peer-reviewed publication online that we can link to, they show that public libraries improve the academic performance of children, which is something that local communities care a lot about. Now, we showed that this had effects on the short run, on 3rd through 8th graders, a few years after the library investment occurred. But we know from a large academic literature that improved achievement in these early grades can have compounding positive effects on students later in life. So we would expect to see that if children are reading more or learning more or doing better on their tests, they are then going to graduate from college at higher rates, or graduate from high school at higher rates, or go into the workforce and have better jobs, right? These are things that happen after these large increases in test scores. Now, what are the next steps? So we're thinking about follow-up work. We're thinking about continued research, deeper exploration, and collaboration to strengthen these public library systems and to understand how public libraries affect children. So people often reach out to us from public library systems and they say, well, what should we do with your research? Well, one thing you can do is you can cite it if you're talking to people about why public libraries are useful. Another thing you can do is we can try to think about ways where we can work together to analyze data from your own system and try to understand how specific people within your system are, affected by public libraries. So I think public libraries should do more to document the people who are using the library and the benefits that people have from the library. And I'm currently trying to find public library systems where we could work with school districts to say, well, if you work within, if you have a kid who's doing summer reading programs, they are then doing better in school the following year. If that's true, I would love to document it because I don't think that's been quantitatively documented by anyone before. And so there are all of these questions that I would love to dig into about how public libraries affect local communities. We can move beyond children. Adults in the library I grew up with were often given help with filing their taxes through the VITA program or other programs that are available for tax preparation, right? We saw people take out different types of books that could help them with getting a job or administrative tasks that they needed to do as part of their life, apply for food stamps, right? And so these are things that libraries provide, which I think are often not well documented. And documenting and quantifying the important effects that libraries have on people who are using the library seems very valuable within the themes of this talk and what we were talking about today. So I think I want to stop there and make sure if anyone has questions or follow-up commentary, we can dig in. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Ezra. And please feel free to use chat, or you can unmute your mic. I have a couple questions for you, Ezra, while people might be typing.
Definitely.
Did you look at and compare, because one thing that came up to me as you were talking was, and maybe it's because I've worked with a lot of local government officials, well, why not just invest in the schools? Like, why invest in the library? Did you look at that piece? And
yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's this thing that happens, which is there's a limited pot of money for local communities to use. And
Mhm.
schools are obviously important, right? I think some of my other work starts to look at how schools affect children. I think that can be a really important mechanism for children to do better in life. And um, libraries are clearly like, I would rather live in a world with schools and no libraries than I would live in a world with libraries and no schools. Because I think, children need to be in school. I have kids, right? I would not get any work done if we didn't have school. There are lots of reasons why schools exist. Um,
Mhm.
but I think it's a false choice in some ways. I think libraries complement schools. The public library where I grew up was co-located on the same campus as the local high school. And so they weren't separate institutions. They were really places where people hung out. The high schoolers would leave school and then go hang out at the library. They might be talking and not taking out books, but it was a safe environment for them to be, right? In the teen room, in other rooms, they would be on the computers, accessing the internet in a safe and reasonable way. And so I think what we want to make sure of, if you're advocating for public library spending here, is you want to make sure that public libraries have the support that they need to help schools help children who are going to the school, right? So ideally, if children have access to a public library that meets their needs and they're going to school, those services complement each other. Now, we could get into the nitty-gritty of how much money should be spent on schools and libraries, and that's a very local question that I don't feel at all like we can answer with the research we dug into in this project. But I hope that more people start to look at that and say, is there an appropriate amount of money being spent on libraries given the amount of money we're spending on schools? And the answer might be yes in many places. Or it might be something like, well, yes, but it would be great if public libraries could be open after school hours. And to do that, we need to give them more money so that they can help the school provide like after school support for their students. And that could be students of any age. So I would love to see more discussions between schools and libraries talking about how they can collaborate.
Yeah. And Collet mentioned that it would be a pretty small group, but it would be fascinating to study combined school public libraries.
I agree. I'm fascinated by that question, and it's definitely something I'd like to research in the future.
Yes. And thank you for that, because I agree it's good to think about it as complementary. Denise is actually getting to what is probably my next question for you is it's about your tracking and how to better track
Yeah.
so that we have this information. And she says one challenge is we value privacy and don't track patrons. So it's
Yeah.
hard to track outcomes right next to general statistics. I wonder if you could talk about ways libraries could get better at tracking this information? Like, what do
Definitely.
you need as an economist, and that privacy question as well?
Great. So yeah, I have so many thoughts about that question. So my friend is a professor who studies privacy, and I very much value privacy. I don't think, we should be sharing publicly information that people meant to keep private, especially about, what books they're checking out. But I do think that this complete commitment to privacy is also maybe hamstringing libraries. So let's think about education in schools and health and your health outcomes. We think that everyone should have a lot of privacy. It's legislatively mandated by HIPAA to not have their health information shared widely or with anyone that they don't give permission to share it with. We also think that your kids shouldn't have test score information or other information about how they're doing in school shared publicly. That's FERPA. And yet we still have researchers studying these things. And the way we do that is the institutions are collecting this data for internal use, right? I know that I have a library card. That library card says what books I check out. I am not saying that we should make that data public, but I do think by very carefully analyzing that data in a way that's, approved by institutional review boards and done very carefully, I think we can answer questions about public libraries that we're already answering about very sensitive information from health and schools and other places where we want to be very privacy, secure. But this commitment to never collecting this information, which I think many public libraries have, is I think a bad thing, and it makes it harder for public libraries to argue that they're doing good work.
That's a pretty passionate explanation of why we might have to look beyond the privacy thing. And the other thing I have seen, although not widely, is kind of aggregating the data. So like you look at patrons you help and you have like controlled vocabulary that's like this outcome resulted and the number of patrons and age, which is great. Okay, so Tiffany had asked about the paper has been published and it is available.
Yes, and let me just put a link in the chat, actually.
Thank
So I'm going
you.
to put 2 links into the chat. This is a version of the paper that everyone can read, and it isn't formatted in the published way, but it has all the same text. And then I'm also going to link to the published version, which is paywalled, because how academic journals work, similarly to how like you have to buy ebooks for your patrons, is you have to buy a subscription in order to access the published version of the text. So it is published, and that gives you the citation and link to where it's published. But the first link I sent you has all of the relevant content and figures and results. And if anyone needs a copy of the published, well-formatted version for discussions you're having, you can send me an email and I'll be sure to just send you a copy. I just can't link to a public version of it.
Thank you, Ezra. So Adam is asking if he is in fact getting what you are saying here about approaching local government and advocating for library using empirical data. But the data should also be reflected in improvements to the community that don't have empirical data.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me make sure I understand that. So I think it is really important to advocate using empirical data. And I am definitely recommending that people working at library systems and, in state library associations and other groups do that. It's certainly also the case that there are a lot of outcomes that aren't measured well in data. And so I'm not saying you should abandon those measures, right? There's so one of my favorite anecdotes is that Justices Clarence Thomas and Sotomayor both benefited a lot from the public libraries that existed in their towns growing up. You can find public information about this. Justice Clarence Thomas went to a Carnegie library in, I think, Alabama, maybe Birmingham, Alabama. And Sotomayor went to a public library in maybe it was Queens or the Bronx. And what you can see when they talk about it, I remember this anecdote from Justice Sotomayor, is she says something like, yeah, I was just going shopping with my mom, and then I saw this place where you needed a card and you could get out books, and it had this big effect, right, on me, and it helped me learn how to read, and it helped with all these other outcomes. And we can't quantify the effects of public libraries on the likelihood that someone becomes a Supreme Court justice because we don't have many examples, right? But that's the type of anecdote that I think does a great job of selling the value of public libraries. And what's nice is, it's not politically specific. We have a Republican appointed justice and a Democratic appointed justice, both who benefited from public libraries. And so I think pointing to very important qualitative evidence like that is a valuable pairing with the type of quantitative evidence that I'm presenting today.
And I would say it may depend too on the local government official. Because
Yes.
some local government officials want stories, others want numbers.
Yes.
And I think that was Adam. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so it sounds like perhaps then for the areas that don't have numbers, right? Because my library does track how many programs we do, how many people come through our door, how many books are being checked out and checked in, and we do track a number of things that we do share with the public in our yearly report right now. But we don't track like how does that program improve the community, right? But I might then be able to say, well, the mission of that program was to say increase literacy, right?
Yep.
And then I could explain that we had this many of those programs during this time frame when there was nothing else supporting that. So then summer reading program, right? Nothing else was supporting literacy in the community publicly, and we had this many programs that set up that literacy improvement. So that as the public school then in a partnership with them was looking to have something help with literacy during the summer, we were there. I would use a story similar to that in place of the empirical data to help convince local officials. Is that kind of what you think?
Exactly. And in fact, you have empirical data. You don't have data on maybe the people attending it, but you know how many events you put on, right? That's data. And I would definitely collect that and share it. If you wanted to be even more ambitious, you could do a survey. You could survey your patrons, or you could survey, anonymously so that they don't have to be linked to information about them. You could have a survey at the front of the library, and you could say, please write down the things you do here that you can't do in other places, or the value you get out of the library. And that's information that you can then aggregate, quantify, write up for discussions with officials. You could work with the school district and try to figure out how many students within the school district are using the library. And Maybe you can work with the school district to register with library cards the people who aren't using the library, to share the set of resources that you have available to them. So I think there's a combination of work from the top down and go straight to the people who have the money, who are deciding how much money the libraries get, but also maybe work bottom up and say, who are the people we're missing, and can we collect information about them and get them more engaged in the library? And I think my sense is that libraries are very good at engaging with patrons who already value the library a lot. But there are a lot of people out there who don't realize the value of the library, both people who are involved in budget decisions, and then also people who could use the library. And figuring out how to engage with them is valuable as well.
Yeah, and I would just say that at the state library, we have the ambitious goal that every Montana kid can read at grade level, because it's pretty appalling. The majority of kids cannot right now. And I know it would be really interesting. I can't quite wrap my head about how to do this statewide, but to like have some volunteers in local communities, like taking you, Adam, and Troy, you take your summer reading program, and if the parents would sign a release, would they allow you to see if the kids that participate in that program have better reading scores later on? I mean, it would be very interesting to take a look at that. So
yeah, I completely agree.
I guess that would almost be then creating my own research paper on the subject, right?
Yeah,
Because I would have that ability if I had a survey like that to do that kind of research.
I 100% agree.
Yeah, it is like that, Adam. Although I was kind of wondering if we think that it's maybe more work than it is, because the kids are already being tested. Like, they have to take these reading tests. And so, if we have permission to just see if this intervention actually worked, but you'd have to, of course, have the control group that doesn't do summer reading to see if their test scores remain the same.
Yeah, and it wouldn't make much sense to try to do the survey without the control group on top of it, because then I wouldn't have something to compare it to.
Yes.
It sounds like it could be kind of tricky too, because I'd want to choose students that maybe were below the reading level currently, right? And they might be the ones who I have the hardest time coming here in the first place.
Yep.
Very interesting thought.
Yeah. Yeah, but pretty powerful when we think about it, if we could figure out how to do it.
Oh my gosh, if it happened and it showed any kind of improvement, it would be really powerful, especially to our community out here.
Yeah, that's what I think too. And sometimes I tell myself, just start small, even though I realize that more aggregate data is probably a better indicator of some correlation. But sometimes I feel like when we try to say we're going to get all the data, then we just freeze because we can't.
Yep.
So there's that too.
Actually, so I do a story time right now. Going to be once a month with my preschool, but because I do it at least once a month, and I could increase it. I just have as I'm new to the program, still wanted to give myself time to research and learn as well before I continued on. But as I have the ability to do more, I might be able to work with them on numbers, especially with phonics literacy, because it'd be a much more supportive group, and my control group would probably be the ones that didn't attend, right? Because there are always those kids who have poor attendance. And that would be an ability to potentially show the difference in having the story time and not.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That'd be very interesting. And Cole shared some of the public sources of student achievement data. Do you have any other questions for Ezra? Anything you want to clarify? I know I would love it, Ezra, and we'll probably take advantage of having met you to like see if I can find a guinea pig library director or librarian willing to help me, and have you look at it and be like, okay, would this result in data that could actually
I love that.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
that'd be great.
I can usually talk people into helping me with these things. Anything else? Do you know, Ezra, have there been any studies about summer reading and test scores?
No.
Okay.
I think there have been 0 studies, which is why I'm so interested in trying to write one, because I think it's a gap in the literature that would really help explain the value of that program.
Because anecdotally, we always say that summer reading helps with the slide, but does it?
Yeah, I think it does, but I don't have any evidence. So it'd be really great to have that evidence. And I just
Okay.
need some school district and public library system to work together on this. And, if you know of anyone who might want to do that, definitely reach out.
Awesome, awesome. Well, it looks like you might have answered everyone's questions. Thank you for sharing your research. It was really helpful. And I did not think you would be able to explain those charts in a way that I would understand what they meant, but you did. I was
I'm
like,
so
oh,
glad.
all right, now I get it. So
Thank you so much for having me. It was really great to meet everyone and to talk about some of this work with actual people working in the space.
All right, thank you very much, Ezra. And Cole, I will turn it back over to you.
No worries. And Denise has just shared something too. I want to make sure that we acknowledge her comment. And Denise too, if you'd like uh, to speak up about your comment. Sometimes your voice is the best one to help us interpret what's going on there.
Well, I saw this, according to studies, teachers observed that students who participated in public library summer reading program returned to school ready to learn. This is a quote, and I've actually took this quote from another piece of literature, which I don't recall anymore, but I've used it on our summer reading report. And if he's saying that there are no studies, I'm like, well, what are we're saying according to studies, but I don't have I can't say what studies they are because I've had this around for a long time and I don't remember where I got it from.
Yeah, I've
Yeah,
never
it's always good to question the source and the authority.
Yeah, and I would say that, there might be some papers that talk about summer reading and how important it is. I just have never seen a quantitative analysis of people where it links people who were using public reading services, in summer programs to academic performance. And so I think these claims are usually not that founded in evidence, but I'm not saying they're completely made up. I think there's a lot of belief out there that these programs work. I just have never seen something carefully done that explores it in a way that I would trust.
And actually, the quote does say teachers observed. There was like,
Yeah. So they probably did a survey of teachers, and the teacher said summer reading programs are great, which supports this quote if it exists, but doesn't convince me as a skeptical economist that this is something I should trust.
Yeah, I think we should and could have a really, really rich discussion about the origin of some of those claims. I know of some great publishing companies who have sponsored summer reading activities and so from that sponsorship perspective, of course, anything that refers to supposed data is going to help sell the books, basically. So yeah, you gotta be careful. Use the sniff test of who's going to benefit from participation when it's a matter of selling books. Which, like I said, different conversation. Maybe over beverages sometime. That would be awesome. All right. Well, Ezra, thank you so much. I do have a couple of things and do keep the ideas going. We love to hear from our participants. We are kind of bread and butter, and the things that help us to plan ahead for upcoming webinars is your responses to our evaluation. So if you have just a few moments, it's just a few questions. We greatly appreciate your responses to our evaluation form. I'll leave that up there for just a couple seconds. You can snap the QR code, or I did put the link in the chat there.
well, luckily AI did help me, by the way, identify.
Oh, it
study.
did. Oh, what did it say, Denise?
There is a recent 3-year study by Dominican University Graduate School of Library Information Studies that confirmed, and I put the link to this, which was in the school library journal.
Excellent. Excellent. I think we'll all be looking at that momentarily. That is awesome. Okay, and then just if you have any questions, anyone about credits for this session, We'll be posting a recording probably a little bit later this afternoon when it is done processing. I'll share links to resources and the information that Ezra shared with us in the Aspen event itself. So do check in, or if you don't want to keep track of where all those things are, just send me an email or give me a call, and I'm happy to help connect you with all of the things that you need to continue to benefit from the learning that we have here today. So with that, thank you, Ezra, so much for your time and your effort. It's so encouraging to know that from the economist perspective and in the research that you're doing, that we're actually getting some answers to how do we make the case for investment in public libraries. And so this just helps us in different disciplines come together and make sure that our communities have what they need. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great to see you all. Bye.
Thanks, Ezra.
Thanks, everyone.